Now, Hans Eysenck, who was my mentor at the Institute of Psychiatry, reckoned that the connection comes through a personality trait called psychoticism. And it includes aspects of novelty-seeking, risk-taking, impulsiveness, nonconformity, self-confidence, and work addiction. And another personality type called schizotypy, which is rather similar in some ways, been found by other researchers, is that if you have some pointers towards some indications of schizotypy, you are more likely to be a creative achiever.
I'm Mujan, and this is the second episode of Still on a Beach podcast. In this episode, we start with one of the most basic questions we had. What is creativity? You might think that study of creativity has quite a long history, but our craze with creativity started really in 1950 with a call made by J.P. Guilford, who was then president of American Psychology Association. It was only a few years after World War II, cities, governments, and societies were trying to rebuild themselves with limited resources they had at the time. So really knowing how one come up with new ideas and how can one solve problems creatively could have been very helpful for communities and countries. His argument was that although we desperately need ways to promote creative thinking, we haven't studied creativity enough to know what happens to someone in the creative process and what creative process really looks like. Before 1950, there were only two prominent works on creativity, one done by Wallas in 1926, and the second was the work by Alfred Whitehead, which was published in 1929, where he coined the term creativity and argued for creativity to be a principle of novelty. With Guilford's call, though, by 1980, you could find more than 60 definitions for creativity in the field of psychology alone. Similar to study of any other phenomena, scholars first started with philosophical understanding of creativity. They were trying to come up with universal definitions. So they started with classical philosophical works on imagination, creation, and geniusness. The first definition they came up with was that creativity is about creation of something new, about bringing something new to the world. Some scholars took that definition and applied it to the works happening in factories. Their argument was that with that definition, all factory workers were creative. Because although they were producing hundreds of the same tool, every single time they were creating something new and they were bringing something new to the world. But we don't consider them as creative. They realized that because most classical works on imagination and creation were concerned with works of art, the uniqueness was almost implied in the word newness. Works of art were known to be products of one's imagination, and it was really hard to argue that two artists could have the same imagination or that they would communicate their imagined entity in the same way. So they tweaked the definition and said creativity is about absolute newness, that something needs to be absolutely new for it to be creative. Other scholars argued that with that definition, most prominent works in history of science that we know were creative can't be labeled creative because nothing in science is about absolute newness. Ideas evolve in science. As Newton famously said, scientists stand on shoulders of the giants. So you see the pattern. Every time they came up with a definition, someone took it, applied it in different contexts, and they could very easily and very quickly disqualify it. So they soon realized that looking for a universal definition, if not impossible, is pretty useless. Because each field had its own way of defining newness and its own way of evaluating usefulness of ideas.
No one could do what Basquiat did because that's an original. That comes from his mind.
So what do you mean? David Cho paints nothing original?
No, he does, but I'm just saying there's more realism. It's abstract. You could
these are two
you could
different...
look at a David Cho painting, although he's a friend of mine, he's very talented, right? And compare it to other people's, right? But with Basquiat, when you see a Basquiat, you know that it's him.
Yeah. Yes, because it's uniquely bad. Because it looks like a child.
No.
It looks like a child's painting in an art museum.
Even a child couldn't do it.
Children do it all the time.
They can't do that.
All the time they do
can't.
it.
The definition we have for creativity today has been polished over the years to reflect what most scholars could agree on. But what's interesting to me is not what ended up in the definition, but what was excluded from this definition because scholars couldn't agree on them. The two most contentious topics around creativity were one, who can create, and two, whether one can come up with any claim about the relationship between the creative process and the creative outcome. The question of who can create today in social science is treated as a political question. What social scientists are interested in is understanding the power dynamics that include and exclude different actors from the creative process. But for psychologists, that was a completely different question. What they were interested in was understanding whether creativity is an innate capacity or is it something attainable? Is it something that you either have or don't, or is it something that you can learn and grow over time? So they designed so many tests and did loads of studies on how one can evaluate and measure the creative capacity and how one can monitor and evaluate its changes over time. The second topic was quite an important but controversial one. The question was whether we can claim that engaging in a creative process would guarantee a creative outcome. That was essentially what Guilford was looking for. If creativity frameworks were supposed to be used to address social and economic problems that societies were facing, making that connection was quite an important one. But between 1950 and 1980, something happened that really changed scholars' attitude towards this question. In 1959, Alan Newell, Herbert Simon, and Cliff Shaw published a report called The Processes of Creative Thinking. In this report, they claim that creativity is not as magical as people think it is. It's not about sudden illumination or the aha moment. And the intuition is not this unknown power people have. They claim that creativity is nothing but a unique information processing in problem solving. So we not only can explain the creative process, we can simulate it using computers. Because creativity for them was just a unique form of problem solving, they argued that we don't even need new theories for creativity, that we can study creativity through decision-making and problem-solving theories we already have. I think it's very important to see their work, the studies they did, and the conclusions they got in its historical context, and it's quite a long story, so I will keep it for the next episode, and just stick to telling you the impact their studies had. Up until that point, Herbert Simon, Alan Newell, and Cliff Shaw had done loads of studies on human decision-making and human reasoning. 3 years before that, in 1956, they had released the first computer model called logic theories that could simulate human reasoning. Listen to Herbert Simon himself telling the story of how they met and why they got interested in this topic.
Then I was a consultant to a research activity going on in California in which we were studying air defense systems. They had to produce a continually updating map of airplanes flying in a particular area. And with the technology available to them at that point, they found a way of getting a computer, a calculating machine, to print out that map. And that gave me the idea that a computer was not simply a thing that did arithmetic. It could process all kinds of different symbols. At that same time, Alan Newell, who was a member of the research group that I was consulting to in California, Alan Newell and I were asking, how can we build a theory of how the people who are operating this air defense system decide that this plane is dangerous and they should send up a pursuit after it, or this plane isn't dangerous. How do they make these decisions? And we felt we didn't have a language in which we could make a theory of that decision-making. And gradually the idea dawned on us that perhaps we could put it in the form of a computer program. And by 55, 56, we began to try to do that. We were further aided by the fact that the organization in which this air defense research was taking place, the so-called RAND Corporation, had one of the first large computers in the United States, one designed by John von Neumann. As a matter of fact, it was called the Johnny-Yak over his objections out there. 1956, my research had switched considerably so that I was mostly concerned with trying to write programs for computers that would simulate human thinking.
Their work and the claims they made in that report changed the narratives around creativity in two main ways. One, claiming that computers can simulate the creative process implied that creative process is pretty much known to us. That it doesn't need to be any more happening in its totality in one's head. That we can map it out, we can divide it into different steps, and we can assign each step to a different actor. That claim made a very strong foundation for what we call we paradigm of creativity today. It not only made it easy to talk about collective creativity, but it also made it possible to talk about institutions of creativity, like living labs that we have today. At the same time, claiming that creativity is nothing but a unique form of information processing, they implied that anyone or anything, given the right data and the right information processing capabilities, could be creative. That we no longer rely on geniuses or creative people to come up with new ideas, that anyone with any capability can participate in the creative process, and institutions of creativity could be ones responsible for providing these capabilities and data. The second impact was on the connection between the creative process and creative outcome. By claiming that one can simulate the creative process, they implied that engaging in that process would guarantee to some degree the creative outcome. That we can provide you with frameworks and steps to reach a creative and novel idea. And that became the core argument of what we call today the creative economy. The fact that we don't find it odd today that businesses, designers, and even governments provide frameworks for creativity, toolkits for creative thinking, and packages for innovation is very telling of how impactful Simon's and Newell's study on creativity was. Their work and the claims they made in that report received quite a lot of backlash. Gruber, in 1988, summarized the works on creativity from 1950 to 1980 by categorizing them into three different categories. First is what he calls the holy cow approach. This is mainly works on creativity that considered creativity as something magical, something that we can't understand and we can't replicate. Well, it's obvious that this approach didn't last long because it provided scholars with no foundation to work on. The second was what he called nothing but approach, works on creativity that reduced creativity to something so ordinary. Herbert, Simon, and Alan Newell's work was in this category. Scholars in this category considered creativity to be not only knowable and explainable, but also replicable. And the third approach, which he didn't choose a name for it, includes works on creativity that kind of sat in between these two extremes. Scholars following this approach believe that although we can spot some patterns of behavior in creative thinking, and although we can explain some aspects of creativity, there are still elements in creative process that we can neither explore nor replicate. It's very interesting to see that in fields like urban planning and engineering, where the individuality of the problem solver is not much of a concern in problem-solving process, the second approach, which is nothing but approach, has gained popularity. And in fields like art and design, where the individuality of the problem solver and expression of that individuality still matters, scholars tend to adopt concepts and ideas from the third approach, which still grants some magical qualities to creativity. In the next episode, I'm going to tell you more about the work Alan Newell and Herbert Simon did on creativity. I'm going to tell you what experiments they did, how they come up with their claims, and what feedbacks they got. I'm also going to tell you how the work on whether computers can be creative or not was a natural progression from a question asked in the 1940s on whether computers can think or not. Tell me what you think about creativity. Do you think we can explain creativity in its totality? Or are there still magical elements in creativity that we can never explain?